Hello to everyone in Iron Springs. It's good to see you. I wish I could be there in person, but at least I can connect with you through technology. So hopefully this will work okay. I'm here at home in Hamilton in my home office on the third floor. And you can see I have a couple of my Fulani hats in the background, and this was Frida's bedroom at one point, but it's working pretty good for me as an office these days. So yeah, so it's good to be with you. And again, I wish that I could have been there with you in person, but the pandemic is still having some effect on us. So Lord willing, in the future, I will make it out to Southern Alberta. I want to thank you for your continued support of my ministry and the ministry of Resonate Global Mission. I just want you to know I greatly appreciate it. And as I'm going to be bringing the word to you this morning, I wanted to begin by just reflecting a little bit on the fact that it's 10 years now since I left Iron Springs. It's coming up to the anniversary of when we packed our car and headed first for classes in Saskatoon, and then moved on down into the US and across, and then up to Hamilton. So it's amazing to think 10 years has already passed. Hard to believe. But I'm very thankful for the ministry that God has given me, and also for your support. And really, this ministry came out of 9/11. So not only is it 10 years in this ministry, but really 20 years since 9/11 happened. And after 9/11, there was this realization that we weren't doing very much ministry to Muslims. I think the church really woke up after 9/11 and thought, what can we do to reach out to Muslims in a more organized manner? There was a recognition, of course, that Muslims were living in our communities more and more, and also that very few missionaries were working with Muslims. If you look at the mission world, most missionaries work with Christian groups globally, and a very small percentage works among Muslim unreached people groups. So that was part of that as well. So the Christian Reformed Church formed a task force called AMAM. It was maybe a little bit too close to Imam, but that's what they called it at the time. AMAM stood for Advancing Ministry Among Muslims. And that's where I came in 2011 into that task force, and we began to work in something we called at that time Salam Project. Salam, of course, is the Arabic word for peace. We wanted this to be all about bringing peace between Christians and Muslims, and also bringing the gospel of the good news. So, and really there were three parts to it in the beginning. The first part was education. So we were all learning about Islam and what Muslims believe and some of their religious and cultural practices. And then another part was, how do we witness to them through holistic gospel witness that cares for the whole person? And then finally, how can we develop interfaith dialogue? So basically increasing dialogue between Christians and Muslims across Canada and the US. Well, that went on for about 3 years, and then for various reasons, some of it strategic, some of it funding, we transitioned to Salam 2.0. As you know, that became a ministry focused just in Canada, and that's when I began to work with what we called back then the network of ministries, the Canadian network of ministries to Muslims. It's since been renamed Loving Muslims Together. I also in time began some work with the Canadian Council of Churches on the interfaith side as well. But it became very focused just on the Canadian context. And then around 2017, I'm trying to remember now all the dates, when we had the new mission agency, we had home missions and world missions come together and merge into one agency that became known as Resonate. And with the coming together of home missions and world missions, it became possible to focus not only on Muslim people groups, but actually all diaspora people groups that are moving around the world for various reasons, whether they're international students, refugees, migrants, or immigrants. We began to think, hey, here's a huge group of people who can use our help and may not know Jesus in any way. So we thought, why don't we focus on that? And it became possible. I know I've said a number of times I'm thankful for that merger, because we could now focus on diaspora people groups. Before that, home missions focused mainly on church planting and campus ministry in North America. World Missions was doing cross-cultural ministry, but overseas, internationally. So nobody was really doing that overlap of cross-cultural international missions here in North America. And so it became possible to do that as the two agencies came together into Resonate. And that became my focus. And that has been my focus, so since about 2017, 2018. And the big shift there was we moved from Salam 2.0 to a new network that was more focused on diaspora people groups called Journeys into Friendship. So just to bring you up to the present time, that is the current network that I mainly focus on in terms of coaching leaders, connecting people together, both in Canada and then now again in the US and actually globally, because of course diaspora populations are everywhere. And just as an example of that is David Krominga and Mary Butine in Berlin, working with diaspora people groups. And then the other interesting thing is this brought me into the area of Persian ministry with Iranians, because we have an active Persian ministry in Toronto, and Mary and David also focus on some Iranian refugees and immigrants in Berlin, and this is starting to pop up all over the place. So it's an interesting new development that we have with this emerging Iranian church. So lots of good things, and just to say again, thank you for all your help with us. So one of the big things about Journeys into Friendship and the ministry that we do in that network is basically focused on friendship, hence the name. And really, we want this to be biblical friendship patterned after John 15. And so this is really barrier crossing friendship that we're both supporting and encouraging. And when I say barrier crossing, I'm thinking of barriers like ethnicity, culture, language, race, particularly in the United States, and religion. So that's how the whole interfaith focus that I had earlier has kind of come back into it again as one of the barriers that we're crossing being religion. So, and certainly Islam continues to be a focus of that. So that is really the gist of our network, and the core or the key text is John 15:15. So let me just read a little bit in terms of bringing a message to you this morning. I'm going to be focusing on the whole chapter of John 15, but in order to get us started, let me choose a few verses here. How about 13 to 15 would be a good place to start. So Jesus says this to his disciples: "Greater love has no one than this, that he lay down his life for his friends. You are my friends if you do what I command. I no longer call you servants, because the servant does not know his master's business. Instead, I have called you friends, for everything that I learned from my Father, I have made known to you." So the amazing truth that we have to begin with is the fact that Jesus has made us his friend. He says to his disciples, I no longer call you servants or even slaves. The Greek word is doulos. I call you friends. So those who follow Jesus, those who call themselves disciples of Jesus, are friends with Jesus. And when you think about that, considering that Jesus is holy God and we are sinful humanity, it's an incredible thing that Jesus has made us his friend. And so that's the basis of our network, that we are first of all friends with Jesus, grounded in Jesus. And then second, if Jesus has made us his friend, then we can be friends with just about anybody, even people that we would never imagine we could be friends with, and maybe even people that we have trouble being friends with. It becomes possible. So that's kind of the key central idea to what we're talking about here in this passage in John 15. But let's just backtrack a little bit and let's begin, in kind of the typical sort of sermonic way of thinking about the trouble that Jesus finds in, as we look at this text in John 15. What is the trouble in John 15? And if we go just a little bit farther into that chapter, into verse 18, we find the trouble. It says in verse 18, "If the world hates you, keep in mind that it hated me first." If the world hates you, keep in mind that it hated me first. So Jesus is preparing his disciples he knows it's not going to be an easy road for them, that the world won't embrace them very easily. And we know that's still the case, but Jesus was preparing his disciples, and it's because the world hates not only the disciples, but ultimately Jesus. Why is that? Well, we know, of course, going back to Genesis chapter 3, the fall, humanity's rebellion against God, and that's what sets up that hatred. And that hatred, of course, is for God. We don't naturally love God and what God requires of us. We shy away from his holiness because of our sinful natures. And also we have trouble loving one another. Too often hate is very evident in our world today, and we see that all over the place. It's a really hard thing, isn't it, that there is so much hatred in the world. Hate speech is on the rise. Maybe you're following the Facebook whistleblower and the algorithms that allow some of this hate speech to spread onto different social media platforms. So ultimately, that is our key problem that we're working against. But of course, we know God is on our side. God has made us his friend. So God is with us in this difficult ministry. One of the things that I remember from my early missionary training, Nellie and I went to Colorado Springs in 1993, and we were with a number of different couples from different mission agencies going to different places. And there was a couple there from the U.S., but who were going to Rwanda, and this was in 1992. And I remember them showing the beautiful pictures of the Rwandan people going to church on these green hills, wearing these long white robes. It looked all so idyllic. Of course, we know that only 2 years later, 1994, I believe it was, the genocide broke out between the Hutus and the Tutsis. Terrible tribalism, even among Christians, broke out, and thousands and thousands of people, almost 1 million, actually died in that genocide. And this poor couple, I remember hearing that they had ended up hiding out in their apartment and having to very, very carefully leave the country, passing through very stressful checkpoints at the risk of their lives. But thankfully they were able to make it out. But they were very traumatized. But the good thing is that people did learn from the Rwandan genocide. And that's one of the reasons why we are supporting and encouraging people to attend 4 workshops next year, workshops called Healing Hearts, Transforming Nations, that train people in trauma healing and reconciliation. And that training comes directly out of the genocide and the healing that has happened in Rwanda. And it's been applied to other places like Ukraine. My colleague George Deweist is using it on the eastern side of Ukraine where there's tensions with Russia. It's also been used in Wales, some of the old tensions between the Welsh and the English, and it's being used in a number of places. And now it's coming to North America. So those are some of the ways that we are working at reconciliation in Resonate Global Mission, and also through Journeys into Friendship. So coming back to our passage in John 15, it's interesting because Aristotle, the Greek philosopher, didn't believe that opposing people or people with big differences could be friends. So he would be skeptical that the Hutus and the Tutsis could actually be friends because they didn't have enough in common. Or his classical example was that an old person and a young person couldn't be friends because they didn't have enough in common. But the concept that we're working with here is that we have something in common right away when we're in Christ. Jesus binds us together. And so it becomes possible to be friends. And so you might come from a very different racial or ethnic or cultural or religious background, but through Jesus and the power of Jesus, you can be friends with others. And I'll talk a little bit about that at the end, about the direct implications for the church today and what that means. But we also know that this is a gift that Jesus gives us. And we know that from just reading a little bit more. I'm going to jump around a little bit, but reading more in the chapter 15 of the Gospel of John. Jesus says, "You did not choose me, but I chose you and appointed you to go and bear fruit." So this isn't something that we choose. We know God is sovereign. God has chosen us for this task, for this ministry at this time. We see that very clearly in that God has chosen us, but he's also chosen us to bear fruit. So he doesn't want us to sit around and just enjoy the fact that we're chosen and that we're Jesus' friends. He wants us to go and bear fruit. He wants that to make a difference in the world. He says, fruit that will last into eternity. And the Father will give you whatever you ask in my name. This is my command. Love each other. So that's pretty basic. Jesus is saying, listen, if you're going to do anything, do this. Love each other. Now you might say, but Pastor Greg, there are certain people that I really struggle with to love. I mean, we all have that. That's just normal, part of being human and part of life. But really, we know that Jesus gives us the power to do this. And how do we know? Well, because we have to go back to the beginning of the passage. Let me just go right back to verse 1. Jesus says, I am the true vine, and my Father is the gardener. He cuts off every branch in me that bears no fruit, while every branch that does bear fruit he prunes, so that it will be even more fruitful. You are already clean because of the word I have spoken to you. Remain in me, and I will remain in you. No branch can bear fruit by itself. It must remain in the vine. Neither can you bear fruit unless you remain in me. So that's the key part here that Jesus says, listen, you can do all things, and I will work in you, but you have to abide in me, or remain in me. Different versions have different words for that word. But remain, some versions have abide. And then, of course, the key passage for chapter 15 is verse 5. I am the vine, you are the branches. So we do all things through the vine, through Christ. If a man or a woman remains in me, and I in him or her, they will bear much fruit. Apart from me, you can do nothing. So this work of friendship is impossible without Christ, without Jesus as the center of it. And that's why our proclamation of the gospel as part of this Journeys into Friendship Network is so important, because it is only through Jesus that we can do this. I was really struck by this in 2017 when Nellie and I were invited to go to a global mission conference in Chiang Mai, Thailand. It was a great opportunity to get together with missionaries from around the globe. And in fact, it was truly a global gathering. There was about 50-50 in terms of people coming from what we would call the developed world and the undeveloped world. And the other thing was, it was about also gender-wise about 50-50. And then about a quarter to a third were people who had come from a Muslim background. So we call them Muslim background believers who had come to Christ. So that was encouraging too, to have so many people at a global missions conference who were coming from a Muslim background. And they compared our meeting in 2017 to the Global Missionary Conference in Edinburgh, Scotland in 1910. And they said, listen, we want to just give you a little bit of a comparison or whatever of how these two missionary global conferences lined up with each other. And they said the interesting thing about it was, in 1910, it was mostly males, elderly males or older males attending this conference. Very few women, very few members from the global south or the less developed world, and of course no Muslim background believers at that time. So, and they wanted to stress that, things have changed so radically because God is at work. So be encouraged by the way God is working in the mission world, and don't give up hope that things are changing. But they also pointed out that, and this was a surprise to me, I wasn't expecting this. They said, we're not going to share a lot of strategies. We're not going to share a lot of new methods for missions. We're not going to talk about do this or do that. We're going to spend a lot of our time abiding or remaining in Jesus. And we're going to really stress that at this conference, that the foundation of any mission effort is your relationship to Jesus. And I was really struck by that at the time. And they said, the reason we feel this way is because in 1910, these mission representatives made all kinds of plans and strategies to reach the unreached. In those days, they called them the heathen. We don't do that anymore, but they made all kinds of plans for the propagation of the gospel. And then we know what happened 4 years later, right? 1914, major war breaks out in the world, World War I, and that goes on for 4 years. And then that finishes, and then what happens? Well, we know more about this now, but they have a global pandemic, right? Spanish influenza breaks out 1919, 1920. And so all of their plans went out the window. They didn't accomplish hardly anything, in terms of their plans and their strategies. But the one thing they did have was that eternal and abiding presence of Jesus in their lives and in their work. And so that's what we really are striving to do today as well, to put our hope and our faith in Jesus and put him at the center. He is our friend. He is with us. And we can do all things through him who gives us strength. So that's pretty important principle in the Journeys into Friendship Network and the way that we coach leaders and form leaders and encourage leaders. And so let me just conclude by giving you just 3 kind of takeaways from what we've been learning about today. And these come from Brother John of Taizé. You may have heard of Taizé. Its worship is very popular. If you go to certain places, you'll find that they have Taizé worship. Large communities often use Taizé worship because it's very repetitive and contemplative and very soothing and very peaceful, and it seems to be a big part of large communities globally. But the other thing that Taizé is known for is, for years and years now, it's been a global gathering of youth from all over the world. Youth go to Taizé in France, and sometimes just out of curiosity, sometimes just to hang out with other youth, and sometimes to find out about Jesus. So Brother John, who's written quite a bit about friendship, has these 3 thoughts that I want to leave you with in terms of implications of our friendship with Jesus and what that means for the church today. So the first thing he says is that, first of all, there's an inward looking to this, and that is that we are friends with each other because of what Jesus has done for us, because he's given this gift of salvation. He's made us right with God. We've been justified, to use that theological language. We've been made just in God's eyes. Nothing that we have done, but Christ has done that for us. It's like we are covered in Christ's righteousness. Again, the theological word for that is imputed. Christ's righteousness is imputed in us. And that makes us right with God, but it also makes it possible for us to be friends with everybody in our community, in our church community. So if anything, we are a collection and a community and a congregation of friends. And that friendship can only grow if we abide and remain in Christ. That's one of the fruits that will be produced from that relationship. The second thing is the outward, and that is that Christ was friends, the Gospels tell us, with sinners and tax collectors. So it's not enough just to be friends within our community. It's also necessary to go out and be friends with those who do not know Jesus in the way that we do, and to befriend people in our communities, and again, befriend people who maybe are very different than us. That's the friendship that we have now, that the possibilities and potential to be friends with all kinds of different people through God's help. So that's the second thing. It's that outward reaching out to people and through friendship. Not that we use friendship. I think the kind of friendship that we're talking about here biblically is friendship no matter what. Even if we're friends with someone who doesn't know Jesus and they never make a decision to accept Christ, we're still friends with them. That's what we're talking about. But who knows, maybe in that relationship they will see how good God is and come to accept Christ. And then finally, this really points to the fact that we have friends in our community. We have friends because of Jesus with those around us, but we have friends all over the world. We are a global community of Jesus followers. And whether you meet somebody from Pakistan or Iran or Mali, we use that country in Africa, or Argentina in South America, wherever you meet a follower of Jesus, you have something in common with them. So it's that recognition that we live in also this amazing global community and global network of believers who more and more are sharing their knowledge and their wisdom and their vibrant faith with us. And it's much more. In the old days, of course, missions went out to many of these countries, and now they are sending missionaries to Canada and the United States. And there's a much more mixing of the global church today, which I think is a really healthy thing. So we have to remember too that the third thing that Brother John reminds us of is that we have friends all over the world in the global church, and that's a tremendous thing too. So thank you for listening to this reflection on friendship. Again, thank you for supporting the ministry that I do with Resonate Global Mission. It is greatly appreciated. I pray for all of you as this pandemic seems to be hanging on too long, that God would be with you as well. And I look forward to and pray for the time when we can again be together in person. Thank you, and God bless.